Thanks so much. I'm Martell Teasley, Dean of the College of Social Work. Really appreciate your time. I want to thank my colleague, Dean Elizabeth Kronk Warner, for the invitation to have today's forum to talk about two books, one by James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time, and the other one by Jesmyn, I want to make sure I get her name right, The Fire This Time. By Jesmyn Ward. Thank you so much. So I'll go ahead and get started there. So that lets you know I'm nervous right off top. I missed the name of the book. But anyway, I really wanted to couch this in kind of three themes. We have several of the questions from participants, and so we'll get into those. I'll spend about 10 minutes, give away to Elizabeth there. And as I prepared for this, I looked at basically three themes. One was the challenge of whiteness, the second one being the question of racial identity for Black folk, and then the whole notion of a search for a home. So let me just start from there. And this is Baldwin, who's writing this book in the 1960s. Baldwin is a very loving person, but very candid in his prose. And so basically he says, he starts off the book by writing a letter to his nephew. He basically says, like, if you let white folks tell you who you are, then they will destroy you because they have no intentions of really telling you who you are. And he actually, but he's not an angry person in that he feels rage. He basically says we must do something with that rage. But he also feels sorry for our Anglo-American colleague, brothers and sisters, and noting that they're basically trapped in a paradigm that makes them feel that they're superior to other humans. And that's extremely problematic to him. And so he says we really must understand that. And the way to tackle that is through love. And so he really says that in the 1960s, at a time we have this kind of a binary approach to civil rights, one that of Dr. King, and then the other one of Malcolm X. And so here he is saying, hey, love is the way through, which is more like, the Dr. King approach. But, if we go through the books, one of the essays in there is by Carol Anderson, and she talks about white rage. And she basically says what you're experiencing contemporarily is not so much Black rage, but, people have a right to be outraged by what has taken place, but also a feeling of white rage, which is basically a little bit more sterile, much more subtle, and there's niceties, law and order, but it takes place in official meetings where people redraw precincts to dilute African-American voting districts, where we zone off school sections, where we engage in over-policing of communities. And there's this sense of rage from whiteness about those things. And so she basically says that part of what you're saying is a reaction to that. And she notes about the creation of Ferguson in the state of Michigan as an example of an area where Black community was over-policed for the purpose of revenues. If you look at the Ferguson report, it says, quote, Ferguson's law enforcement practices are shaped by the city's focus on revenues rather than by public safety needs. The emphasis on revenue has comprised the institution's character of Ferguson Police Department, contributing to a pattern of unconstitutional policing, and has also shaped its municipal court, leading to procedures that rise due process concerns and inflict unnecessary harm on members of Ferguson community. Finally, it says also, many police officers appear to see some residents, especially those who live in Ferguson's predominantly African-American neighborhoods, less as constituents to be protected rather than as potential sources of revenue. And I would just say that there are these Fergusons all over the country, one balled over recently in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And so we have those types of things taking place, which is really in many ways, as you may understand it, a violation of the social contract that we have. And so, as I said, Baldwin feels a sense of sorrow for whites, and even though he understands the meaning of white privilege. And he said they basically had to create ends, he uses another word, for their own use, and that's part of his sorrow. He also says if one is permitted to treat any group of people with disfavor because of their race or the color of their skin, there's no limit to what one will force these people to endure. And so that is why there's such moral outrage to the murder of George Floyd. Everyday, ordinary people, all of us see this as really a travesty, and therefore we cannot be silent. Baldwin would say our silence would be complicit if we are silent about this. And so we must turn that moral outrage into action, and there's lots of work to be done. And so he questions our place here in America. He actually leaves because of that. And so this whole notion of dealing with whiteness. Now let me move into a little bit about the whole notion of the question of racial identity. Of course, one of the challenges of Black folks in America is this duality of self sometimes, questioning who we are as people of color. And as we know from research, particularly out of the University of Chicago and geneticists, that the poorest people in this country are the people with the most West African DNA in them, that is the darkest people. And so there's this kind of rush to get away from darkness, even amongst Black folk. So there's a problem in terms of that. So as you read The Fire This Time and The Fire Next Time, you see these themes about identity really kind of running through there. And there's this notion of this dilemma of Blackness. And it reminds me of a small poem by T.S. Eliot that I'd like to just read for you in terms of this notion of you know, are we African or are we European or what are we as Black people? And it says, who is that third person walking along beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together. But when I look ahead up the white road, there's always another one walking beside you, gliding, wrapped in brown mantle, hooded. I do not know whether a man or a woman, but who is that other beside you? So in other words, this other person in terms of this duality and dealing with the difficult in terms of code switching, in terms of identity development and being Black in America. And so that's a theme that runs through this. And Baldwin basically says that people who oppress you really will never teach you really who you are. So that's really up to Black people in terms of validating themselves, not leaving that to whites. He also says we have to teach ourselves to love ourselves. He says that to heal ourselves and to remedy the question of our identity is first to wrap ourselves in love. And we cannot do that unless we explore and accept our own history and what that means to us. And we must resolve those conundrums of life in terms of our own history. He also says that part of our loving ourselves means that we have to love other people and kind of, you know, work on them in terms of kindness and challenge them to do the right thing out of that love. And he's basically talking about white folks here. And so one of the authors in The Fire This Time speaks about healing ourselves and healing the wounds that come with our historical narratives, healing our alienation from one another, healing our alienation from Blackness, and healing our gender identities and our spiritual selves, healing through all of these ways. Yet Baldwin states that there is a limit to our need to learn to love. We need to understand that there are limits to making peace with atrocities. And in case you don't know it, what we are experiencing really are atrocities and absurdities, as he says. And really the social compact is broken and violated in many ways. There are really challenges with African Americans in terms of the criminal justice system. I really think it's a very broken system. You don't know what you'll get at any time. If I leave my office that I'm in now and get stopped by the police, I'm just not sure what may happen, to be frank with you as an African American. And it has happened to many, many times. How many of you have had a gun pointed to your head and never even received a ticket? Or if you receive a ticket, you got a gun pointed at your head. So those types of things. And then we've seen people who are shot just for reaching for the license. Absurdities gave birth to Black Lives Matter, and absurdities also have led to our state of moral outrage. So finally, this notion of a search for a home here in America. And, you know, Baldwin consistently talks about that. He leaves America. He really doesn't like Harlem. He thinks about being a priest early in life, but he has problem with what he perceives as racism in the Bible. So he gives up on that. And he leaves and he goes to France, and it's during the 60s. So he's having a lot of problem with what's going on here. And so his constant search for a home is part of his search for an identity and a place of rest. And home is not a place also, as it says in Jesmyn Ward's book in the piece titled Lonely in America, that home is not a place where our burial grounds are dug up for new housing complexes or roads or malls, as she talked about in Portsmouth, Virginia, and as we've known in New York, as we've known about in New York and other places. Home is not a place where your life should end after deciding to jog down the road in your neighborhood, or walk on the side of the road, or buy a bag of Skittles, or selling loose cigars on a street corner, or not using a turn signal after being stopped by a police officer. Then you don't have a place where you feel that you can rest, relax. Home is a place that you should feel free of suspicions, and you should trust everyday ordinary interactions and institutional arrangements. And African Americans don't feel that trust sometimes, particularly when it comes to law enforcement. And Isabel Wilkerson has a piece in there, and out of her book, Warmth of Another Sun, which is a story of the great migration of African Americans from the North to the South, approximately from the 1920s up to the 1950s. She states that Black people went from snow to the sun in search of home. And after that, she talks about both the North and the South starting to put particularly Black men in jail cells through the prison industrial complex. And so we go from the sun to the snow to the cells to find a home. And so while African Americans know that they are at home here in this place, we've solved that question. This is our place of domicile. It has been hard for us to build a space that we call home, where we are free to be ourselves, and where we can relax our spirit. And I close by saying that any people who cannot relax their spirit cannot truly feel themselves at home.
Thank you, Dean Teasley, for those incredible, poignant comments. I'm so incredibly happy that we're here to discuss these important issues, and I appreciate what you shared with us. My name is Elizabeth Kronk Warner. I have the honor of being the Dean of the S.J. Quinney College of Law. In addition to being Dean of the College of Law, I'm also a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. So although I am phenotypically light-skinned, I live my life as a person of color and have certainly thought deeply about these issues as Dean Teasley has. I think I speak for my brother Dean when I say that I don't think we're here today to hold ourselves out as experts, but merely as two people at the University of Utah who have been thinking very deeply about these issues of race and racism for our entire lives. And so that's why we're here to be happy to have this conversation today. My pronouns are she and hers, and I would also like to start off by just acknowledging in my personal capacity that today I'm coming to you from the Salt Lake City Valley. And the Salt Lake City Valley traditionally was a place where Indigenous people came to gather. And so it seems really appropriate that we acknowledge that tradition and that we gather here. And many of us are probably coming from the Salt Lake City Valley. So I wanted to acknowledge that tribal and Indigenous ancestry that we find here in this area. I also want to acknowledge that one of our books today is, of course, The Fire Next Time, as Dean Teasley said, which was written by James Baldwin in the 1960s. And James Baldwin not only serves an important role for many African American and Black communities in the United States, but also as a man who was out and gay, it's appropriate that we should be discussing his work during Pride Month. So I want to acknowledge the intersection of his work, both in terms of race and in terms of LGBTQ+ rights. I do want to talk about James Baldwin's book, but I do want to acknowledge that he uses the term Negro throughout his book. So there are a couple of quotes from his book that I thought were particularly poignant and want to discuss. And so I will use that term when quoting from his book. But of course, that term is one that no longer is used today and has certainly very disturbing historical roots. So I want to acknowledge that before I talk about those specific quotations. So bouncing into kind of building off of Dean Teasley's themes, there were a couple of themes that looking at The Fire Next Time and The Fire This Time that really stuck out to me as well. And first theme that I noticed was this concept of boundaries that are laid on Black communities and communities of color that don't apply elsewhere. And in looking at James Baldwin's book, which of course is The Fire Next Time, he speaks about this at page 26 and 27. when he talks about this concept of a Black man having to be good. And he must be good not only in order to please his parents and not only to avoid being punished by them. Behind their authority stands another, nameless and impersonal, infinitely harder to please and bottomlessly cruel. And this filters into the child's consciousness through his parents' tone of voice as he's being extorted, punished, or loved. In the sudden, uncontrollable note of fear heard in his mother's or his father's voice when he has strayed beyond some particular boundary. He does not know what the boundary is, and he can get no explanation of it, which is frightening enough. But the fear he hears in the voices of his elders is more frightening still. The fear that I heard in my father's voice, for example, when he realized that I really believed I could do anything a white boy could do and had every intention of proving it, was not at all like the fear I heard when one of us was ill or had fallen down the stairs or strayed too far from a house. It was another fear, a fear that the child, in challenging the white world's assumptions, was putting himself to the path of destruction. And this concept of boundaries is further talked about in The Fire This Time, in Garnett Cadogan's essay, Black and Blue, where he says that he has to come up with rules. He talks about how growing up in Kingston in Jamaica, he grew up walking, and walking was very important to him. But when he moves to the United States, and specifically New Orleans and New York, he has to come up with these rules to survive that will allow him to still walk. He says, quote, I returned to the old rules I'd set for myself in New Orleans with elaboration. No running, especially at night. No sudden movements. No hoodies. No objects, especially shiny ones and hard. No waiting for friends on street corners, lest I be mistaken for a drug dealer. No standing near a corner on the cell phone for the same reason. He goes on to say, quote, for a Black man, to assert your dignity before the police was to risk assault. And I think Dean Teasley talked about that in a really poignant way when he talked about not knowing what's going to happen to him when he leaves his office today at the University of Utah. Similarly, in The Fire This Time, there's an essay called The Wait, where the author talks about, quote, what Baldwin understood is that to be Black in America is to have to demand for dignity, be at absolute odds with the national anthem. And you may think maybe these are limited circumstances or they are merely things that are being played upon in these books. However, in my own personal experience, I have seen this. So for example, as an administrator, I had a Black faculty member and we were learning about active shooting training. And my Black faculty member came to me and said, I'm going to need some sort of protection because if we have an active shooter and I come out of the building, the police are going to assume that I'm the shooter and I'm going to get shot. So as part of our active shooter training and our planning for an active shooter event, myself and that Black faculty member had an actual plan where, God forbid, we should ever encounter an active shooter situation. My plan was to try to get to her to make sure that the police would not mistake her as the active shooter and accidentally shoot her. And so I think that's a really poignant real life example. Similarly, I have another acquaintance in my personal life who received a FedEx package that should have been given to her neighbor across the street. However, rather than walking the package across the street and returning it to the neighbor who she didn't know, she insisted that FedEx come and pick it up and return it to the neighbor because she feared what might happen to her if she merely appeared on a doorstep of an unknown person with a package in her hand. I also saw a theme of backlash against Black and people of color advancing in our community and what happens when we step out against these boundaries. So in Carol Anderson's essay, White Rage, which Dean Teasley also mentioned, she says that, quote, for every action of African-American advancement, there's a reaction and a backlash. And I have to say that when I read that, this moment that we currently find ourselves, this moment of anti-protests, anti-racist protests, and of George Floyd's death and of Breonna Taylor's death, I have to wonder if we are finding ourselves in this moment of backlash. This moment of backlash following the historic election of President Barack Obama, but now we find ourselves engulfed in these anti-racist protests. Isabel Wilkerson, in her essay, Where Do We Go From Here?, goes on to say, quote, we seem to be in a continuing feedback loop of repeating a past that our country has yet to address. Our history is one of spectacular achievement, as in Black senators of the Reconstruction era, or the advances that culminated in the election of Barack Obama, followed by a violent backlash that threatens to erase the gains, and then a long, slow climb to the next mountain where the cycle begins again. She goes on to say, quote, there was a lynching every 4 days in the early decades of the 20th century. It's been estimated that an African American is now killed by police every 2 to 3 days. So again, drawing those parallels between this iterative cycle that seems to be happening again and again in American history. I also saw in these two books a theme of indifference. James Baldwin in his book says, quote, white people were and are astounded by the Holocaust in Germany. They did not know that they could act that way, but I very much doubt whether Black people were astounded, at least in the same way. For my part, the fate of the Jews and the world's indifference to it frightened me very much. I think we can parallel to this narrative of indifference that we've been recently hearing, specifically around the officers who did not actually kneel on George Floyd's neck, but stood there and watched as another kneeled on George Floyd's neck for over 8 minutes. And I know that there has been a lot of dialogue about why those officers did that and why they stood by and allowed for it to happen. And so there is this question of indifference. One of my colleagues at the College of Law talks about bystanders and how bystanders enable racism that happens and abuse that happens. And so I think that that's something that we really need to question, especially those of us who are not in the Black community. Are we bystanders, and are we enabling things that we are actually seeing? And I think that's an important part of our reflection. Another theme that I saw in both books was this idea of tokenism. In Baldwin's book at page 58, he says, quote, whether in private debate or in public, any attempt I made to explain was met with a blankness that revealed the little connection that the liberals' attitudes have with their perceptions of their lives, or even their knowledge. Revealed, in fact, that they could deal with a Negro as a symbol or a victim, but had no sense of him as a man. We often hear concerns of tokenism on campus. I know this is something that our diverse students have raised with me personally at the College of Law. This idea that perhaps we're using their image or their activities to advance the interests of the institution without seeing them as a whole person. And it's something that we struggle mightily at the College of Law and at the University of Utah to address, to make sure that those students know that we do value them and we do see them as a whole person and important contributors to our community, and not merely pictures to be used in our publications. But there's another concept of tokenism that these books talk about, and that's the failure to deal with hard problems, that the token being our willingness to merely deal with the easy problems and to avoid the systemic racism and issues that plague underneath. And so James Baldwin says, quote, the sloppy and fatuous nature of American goodwill can never be relief on to deal with hard problems. These have to be dealt with, when they have been dealt with at all, out of necessity. And in political teams anyway, necessity means concessions made in order to stay on top, unquote. And I have to wonder if this is the moment we are currently in. The anti-racist protests are calling for deep reflection upon our history of systemic racism. And these are incredibly hard conversations. They're conversations that should and do make us uncomfortable. And I think it's because of that hardness that we find ourselves in this situation, because as Baldwin points out in his book, perhaps we have not adequately dealt with these issues in the past. I think the question that comes up quite a bit is, what can I do? And we saw in the questions that were presented, and thank you to those who did ask questions, some variation on this theme. So for example, many of the questions that we received in anticipation of today's discussion related to some version of what can I do, or what can individuals do? So for example, we received questions that said, I'm not sure what to do locally to diminish racism in addition to continue to work on myself. I'm a Caucasian female. Another attendee asked, how can people get rid of racism in themselves? Someone else said, how can I as a white privileged man best show my support? Another, what actions can individuals take to make this time in history a time of true change? Also, there were questions related to allyship. What can I do in real terms to become a true and active ally? And I think Baldwin gives us an exercise. If you look at page 103 of his book, he does something that I think is eye-opening, because oftentimes even the best of us think, oh, it's not me, I'm not racist, but we have blinders on to other people's experiences. And so he gives us an exercise that we can participate in. So he says, ask any Negro what he knows about the white people with whom he works, and then ask the white people with whom he works what they know about him. And I think this goes back to the point of tokenism and really knowing the individual versus knowing merely superficial knowledge of them. And so I encourage everybody to engage in some form of that exercise. If you are supervisors or employees, ask and find out what is known and understood in your community. Also, further, Baldwin goes on at the very end of his book to really spell out that everything is now in our hands. We have this incredibly poignant moment. And he says, and here we are at the center of the arc, trapped in the gaudiest, most valuable, and most improbable water wheel the world has ever seen. Everything now, we must assume, is in our hands. We have no right to assume otherwise. If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks, who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the others, do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. If we do not now dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy, recreated from the Bible in song by a slave, is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time. And so I think that's really impactful that he says that this is literally in our hands to work through. So what can you do as individuals? Again, building on these themes of questions that we received in anticipation of today's discussion. And I think there are various phases, and you really have to reflect on yourself and where you are in these phases. So first, there's the listening phase. I encourage you all, if you haven't done so already, to listen to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, to understand and to believe what they are saying. I think oftentimes our inclination is to assert, oh, it's not that bad, and you must be misunderstanding, but to truly listen and to believe. And once you've done that, you can move to the next phase, which is the learning phase, where you are doing exactly what you're doing now. You read books and you read materials and you watch shows to help yourself truly understand what's happening around the country. Once you've done that, you can move to the leading phase, where with that listening and learning behind you, you can start to believe and to understand how you can lead in your own space and make a difference. Once you've done that, you can then move into an auditing and reporting phase, where you can actually come up with identifiable matrix upon which you can try to break down systemic racism. So for example, at the College of Law, all of our senior administrators have been asked to come up with a bias disruptor for their unit, where they can review their unit, understand and try to articulate where systemic racism may be impacting that unit, and then report back as to how they are disrupting it. The last phase is the iterative phase, recognizing that we can never rest on our laurels, that even once we've done all of this great work, we need to be constantly reflecting on it and looking for ways to improve. So then there is a question that we received that says, how can we see our own racism when we believe we have none? And I think this is truly one of the most difficult things. First, I point out that we can look at what is racism. So racism is prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against a person or people on the basis of their membership of a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is minority or marginalized. So really reflect on that. Do you have prejudice? Do you discriminate, or do you have antagonism directed against a particular person? And to help you in this exercise, I encourage you to seek out the Harvard implicit bias tests. There are numerous tests. You probably won't have time to take all, but I think that if you engage in taking those tests, it will be incredibly helpful for you to ascertain and understand your own biases. And we all have them. I have taken those Harvard implicit biases tests, and even though I myself am a person of color, and I certainly understand the challenges of my own community, I don't understand the challenges of other communities, and I certainly have prejudices myself. I also think it's helpful to think of white supremacy in a difficult way. And this articulation of white supremacy comes from the book Chokehold, which was written by Paul Butler. And he says that white supremacy is the belief that white people are superior to those of all races, especially the Black race, and should therefore dominate society. Although the phrase calls to mind the Night Riders of the Ku Klux Klan, it is more helpful to think of white supremacy as law scholar Francis Lee Ainsley defines it in an article that was published in the Cornell Law Review. And he defines it as follows, quote, a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. Conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement are widespread, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings. So if we think of racism and white supremacy as being political, economic, and cultural systems in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources, I think this issue becomes much easier to see. If we look in our community, I think it's true, I certainly see this, that we see that that is the case and that whites do have the majority of power and control in those areas. And so I think that that's a helpful way to definitely look at this issue. Another question we received said, in White Fragility, a current popular book, the author claims that just being white means you're a racist. I think that the mere racial identification isn't necessarily what constitutes racism. It's rather looking at these systemic reasons, these cultural and these economic reasons, where many who are white or Caucasian do have the power, that we can see that there's underlying problems there and that those are the systems that we can work towards dismantling. Last but not least, and then I'll turn it back over to my brother Dean Teasley, to answer some specific questions that he got about the College of Social Work from you all. There was one very specific version of the what can I do myself that I did want to address. So this question said, will there be any discussion of how I can apply these concepts and practices as a teacher in an elementary school setting? So I hope that you who submitted this question is there. And for those of you who may be teachers, there are a couple of good opportunities for you. So first, I encourage you to read the book Stamped, which is by Jason Reynolds and Ibram Kendi, because it specifically talks about this issue of how we can boil down these issues and talk about them at every level of our community, from the very young to the very old. Also, I encourage you to look at the website teachingtolerance.org, again, teachingtolerance.org, that specifically talks about this issue. And or please reach out to Mary Burbank, who is the head of the Urban Institute for Teacher Education at the University of Utah. Or I encourage you to reach out to Professor William Smith, who heads up the Education, Culture, and Society department, also at the University of Utah, and is really engaged in field shaping work on this concept of racial battle fatigue. Those are all excellent resources. But what I absolutely encourage everyone to do is not to stay silent. I think sometimes we don't want to talk about race and racism because they're hard issues and we don't know what to say. But the research overwhelmingly says that silence is the number one thing that we can do to perpetuate these systems of racism. So you don't have to be perfect, but anything you do to challenge and discuss these issues is incredibly important. So Dean Teasley, I know that you had some specific questions that came in for the School of Social Work.
Dean Warner, thanks so much, and let me address some of those. First, let me say, in following up on your excellent presentation, that one of the things we have to do is give people space in terms of feeling uncomfortable about dealing with issues of race. And so this pertains a little bit to the first question, which is, being a mental health worker and a person of color, I find it hard to deal with transference when one of my clients faces discrimination. How do you handle this in a session? Well, part of that is I have an acronym that someone told me a few years back called LOVE. So we were talking about Baldwin with love, and it basically works out pretty well. So it's listen, observe, validate, and explain. And so we want to listen to people, and we want to really get at those presuppositions that they have about people of color. You know, my wife is a K through 12 school teacher, or she's an administrator now, but she told me that the hardest and the most political subject in schools is social studies. And so, because we don't give a good overview in terms of the historical narrative about race and racism in our country, we glorify it and gloss over it, and we make it seem as if it's solved by the civil rights movement and certain laws, when we have created a whole nother structural system that is extremely problematic. So we must listen to people, and it takes a certain stomach to deal with racism, even reading about race. So just this weekend, my wife and I were looking at a presentation about slavery, and she said, "Oh, cut that off." And I said, "No, leave it on. We need to look at this. We need to deal with all the horrors of it." And that's very because it's extremely problematic. And that was something that came from Baldwin, where he talked about whites really not wanting to deal with certain things. And so we didn't really deal with the Holocaust of enslavement. We did not deal with the Holocaust of our Jewish American brothers and sisters. We really haven't dealt with the Holocaust of our Native American brothers and sisters. And we really haven't dealt with what happened in the Civil War. You know, Abraham Lincoln and Karl Marx were contemporaries, and Marx wrote a letter to Lincoln, said, I knew you guys liked slave, it was very profitable, but how did you kind of kill half a million of each other over this institution? We really haven't dealt with these things. But in terms of working with clients and discrimination, we have to understand that people have been very poorly socialized, and that's the whole notion about racism. So, you know, at about 3 months, children can basically distinguish between people in terms of faces and people who look very similar to them, and they start to make bonding with them. They start bonding before that, but they start to see these things. And about age 3 or 4, you start to make real differences about race and racial groups. And then as you become an adolescent, you really start to have challenges about your own racial identity and other forms of identity. And schooling sends lots of messages to us in the socialization process. And that's why it was so important to start taking down the symbols of racism. And so as you see many of the statues coming down. So someone also asked me, have you ever faced discriminations in a Black mental health professional? I've basically faced discrimination because I'm an African-American as a Black person, not necessarily because I was a mental health professional. Now, racism happens everywhere in everyday ordinary life. So about a month ago, I was going to the store. About a couple of months ago, I went to the store at 6 in the morning and I had a hoodie on. And I noticed that there was a policeman outside doing his normal patrolling in the parking lot. But once I went in the store, the next thing I know, the guy was standing right next to me, checking me out. Well, I knew I had been followed. He proceeded to leave the building at that time. And so, you know, how do I deal with that? And that's a little bit different than what other people do, because for me, as I understand these situations that we've described and this whole notion about being home and not being able to relax, for me, the Grim Reaper was around the corner. And so I wanted to get away from as quick as I can. Some people said to me, well, why do you confront him? And I asked him why. No, the odds are quite different for us. And so there are different types of things we have to do, different types of strategies that we have to inform. Also, someone asked about experiencing microaggressions from fellow colleagues. Yes, microaggressions I have experienced, and I probably participated in them myself. Microaggressions are very harmful to people. We know from research that people build up certain levels of cortisone and stress based on microaggressions, and it has an enduring effect over times on people. We all somewhat gauge in stereotypes, basically balling back to how we were socialized about certain things. And that's why we have to learn a lot more. And just in general, lots of things that we found out in schooling is not true. It's one thing about race, But how many of you were taught that there were 7 planets? You know, there was a time when people thought that the earth was flat. So most our knowledge continues to revolve. Humanity continues to revolve and evolve, as well as racism continues to be very malleable as well as evolve. And so the things we learned about overt racism in the past are quite different than what Dean Warner talked about in terms of much more systemic ways of engaging in racist acts today. Someone else says, how do we do more to teach social work students that they have a responsibility to work on social justice issues? What are concrete ways the College of Social Work and the university will commit to making the university more inclusive, supportive, and safe for students, staff, and faculty of color? I think that's an ongoing slog. The university has tried many things, to be frank with you, and part of it has been revamping the campus police recently, putting up more signature, more people walking around. But then central administration is looking at greater ways of engaging in diversity and inclusion. How do we maintain and retain folk of color from certain groups of faculty members and students? And that's a real challenge in my college as well as others. So one of the things I found out when I was at Florida State University, and I was the first African-American to make tenure there outright. There were others who were appointed before I came, but I started there as an assistant professor and went through the whole ropes. But the thing I noticed was that while many of my colleagues, they were fine people, but we didn't have a nexus with each other. And so therefore they had certain advantages. They got certain information that I didn't get. And they had research agendas that overlapped. Many minority folks get into social work to do something about the conditions and the context within the communities in which they came from. And so, but that may not be the agenda of many of our Anglo-American colleagues. And so tenure and promotion can be a lonely road when you're by yourself doing that. The other challenge is teaching, where we talk about microaggressions, discrimination, prejudice, racism, and all the isms in social work. And for as well as law or any other disciplines. And what we see is a lot of minority people asked to do these things. And so Dean Kronk Warner, as well as I, probably got a lot of calls when these things happen. Hey, what do you think about this? Which for me, in many ways, many of my African-American brothers and sisters may find insulting, because it's like, hey, you should know a little bit about the civil rights movement by now, you are a professional. The other side of the coin is that it gives me an opportunity to talk to people about certain things, and I've had certain discussions. And so that's what it's going to take. And that's the love that Baldwin was talking about. And while I feel you may need to know certain things, and I may need to know certain things, we've all been through that, what I problematic socialization process in terms of our learning about race and racism, other types of things that we continuously struggle with. And then someone asked, what is the College of Social Work doing to address these issues? And so we're doing quite a few things. We'll continue to hold forums. I love to see more student forums and student engagement, particularly from the alumni. We're putting on programs as well as actually looking at our curriculum and what should be inside of there in terms of reading, primary reading, as well as supplemental reading. Also, we've put a huge focus on diversity and inclusion within our college in terms of the recruitment of new faculty and staff members. And so I won't give you particular numbers there to try to sort of tokenize the people that we have, but also to say that we deeply care about diversity and inclusion. And that is an ongoing slog. I heard Cornel West once say, diversity is like a fine-tuned jazz band with all of the instruments playing together in one harmonious, to make one harmonious melody. And that's kind of how we all fit together in terms of this multicultural nation that we live in. We all have roles. One thing I want to address that my colleague, Dr. Warner talked about, Dean Warner talked about, is the notion that someone said, hey, well, I think I'm pretty well versed on race and ethnic and discriminatory issues. Well, that's fine. I may be healthy, but other people in my family are not. And so I have to help nurture them back to health. And so for those of us that can and do think that we have got it in terms of understanding race and ethnicity, the challenge for us is to talk to people who are not like-minded. It's easy for me to talk to people who are like-minded, but it's hard to take on those people, even in my own family, who I think have problematic thinkings about things. Again, it's through love. Listen, observe, validate, and explain. But first we have to read. And so there's a lot of new information coming out that we didn't know. And we have to continuously update ourselves. And we take it in terms of race and ethnicity that, we've been socialized to it and so we know. But I would challenge that Dean Warner learns a lot about law all the time, and she would not just stop looking at her law library, and that it's updated quite a bit, as well as text within social work books in any discipline. And so we are continuous learners about race and ethnicity and the ways in which we should get along and create greater brother and sisterhood in our society. I'll stop right there.
No, I absolutely agree with that 100%, Dean Teasley. And I think that's why the last step in our own personal development really needs to be an iterative process, and we can never stop learning. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so incredibly excited that we read these two books, because I feel pretty confident that I understand many of the issues affecting Indian country and Indian communities, because those are the communities I grew up in. So I understand them on a very deep level. I am not a Black person living in America. And so I learned so much. So even though I may be at an advanced stage of understanding with regards to my own community and experiences, when it comes to other communities within the United States, such as the Black community or the African American community, people with disabilities, I don't have that level of understanding. And so I myself am constantly engaged in educating myself and learning. And that's why I really enjoyed these two books. So building off of Dean Teasley's comments that he just had when you were talking about how you talk to your family about these issues, one of the questions we received is, how do I talk to employees about race and racism? Which I think is a really difficult, I just want to acknowledge the difficulty of that. I can't tell you how many times, like the School of Social Work at the College of Law, we're engaged in trainings and discussions. And of course, because we're all people who've been successful in academic lives, we're really reticent to engage in any sort of conversation where we don't know what people are going to say, or we don't know what the right answer is. And I think that's what makes conversations about race and racism really difficult, because you don't know where individual people are coming from, and you don't know what their experiences are, and you don't want to say the wrong thing because you're scared that you're going to be perceived as a racist or as uneducated. And so I do want to acknowledge that these are incredibly difficult conversations. But that being said, every campus climate study I've seen, every conversation I've had with a student or a staff member or a faculty member has had some version where they've expressed frustration, has had some version of that frustration having a genesis in silence. That when we don't engage in these conversations because we either don't feel like we know what the right thing is to say, or we're going to make them worse, that in and of itself makes it worse because of the silence. And so I want to start off by acknowledging that these conversations won't be perfect, but fully encourage you to have those conversations with your employees. So even just starting off the conversation, for example, by saying, I know that George Floyd's death has been in the news, and I know that this has made many people in our community very upset, and that they are now calling for challenges to the racist systemic systems that we have in place in the United States. I acknowledge that. I'm not sure how we move forward from this place. Help me to move forward. Where are you? How are you feeling? So for example, after the killing of George Floyd, I reached out to many Black and African American people in my life. I didn't necessarily know what to say, but I knew that they were probably hurting. And just to say, I'm thinking of you, and if there's anything I can do to support you, please let me know. Let me know what would be helpful to support you, but just creating that space to say, I'm thinking of you. And I've had this chance to get very close to some of my sister deans in the law school world. And there are several of us who are women of color. And we were on a Zoom call together. And I said, I just want to take a moment to make sure if you are okay. And even though I didn't say anything more than that, it wasn't particularly articulate or informed. Many of my sister deans said to me that that was incredibly impactful because they didn't have to bring it up. They didn't have to be the ones to say, we're hurting. This is a really difficult moment. The fact that somebody who was not Black raised that issue was really impactful to them. So I think when you're thinking about talking to others in your family or your employees, if it's not something you're comfortable, it's fine to say, I'm not comfortable with this, but I care about you and I care about this moment and I care about what's happening in our country. So I want to have this conversation. And then you can move through those steps that we talked about earlier. The listening step. Hearing your employees, hearing their vulnerabilities, hearing their fears and believing them, and then educating yourself. So reading books, participating in webinars, then figuring out where you can lead. So once you've done that work, you can figure out how you can lead your employees and how you can lead your businesses to better address these issues. So as I mentioned earlier at the College of Law, I charged each of my senior administrators who oversee various departments from admissions to career development to even our IT department to come up with a bias disruptor of some way that their department can work on challenging these systemic areas of racism. And then you create goals that you can actually report on and audit to make sure that you are moving forward. And then once you've done all of that work, you get to rest for 15 minutes, and then you get to start all over again because it's an iterative process. And unfortunately, there are things that we constantly have to be educating ourselves and working on. So these, I just want to acknowledge that these are very difficult conversations, but I think they're important conversations. And even if you're just starting from a place of, I recognize that something's wrong, but I don't entirely understand what's wrong, please help me. That's a great first step. We also received some questions about what should students, staff, faculty, and administrators on our campus be doing at this moment, and how should curricular changes be made to educate students on this history. So I think as students, staff, faculty, administrators who are engaged in our community, we can all be engaging at some level, and each of us is in a different place in our process in terms of that listening, educating, leading, auditing, reporting, and then reflecting, and the iterative processes. So I would really encourage you, no matter where you are and part of our community, you all have a role to play, but to reflect on where you are and to see how you can move forward. Also, like Dean Teasley, we are engaged. I can say that many of us at the University of Utah, including our senior leadership teams, are very interested in these issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility, and are working through in very meaningful ways, making improvements upon that. And so we are working to move the ball forward. In terms of curricular change, I think there are opportunities for every class, no matter what you teach. So at the College of Law, everything from environmental law to business law can have pieces on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how we can advance that and challenge these systemic systems within our country. And so I really encourage each faculty member, again, to engage in that 5-step process to see how you can incorporate that into your curriculum. And with that, Dean Teasley, I think we have time for one last question. And I thought a nice question for us perhaps to end on would be, how are you personally managing the exhaustion that's resulting from these accumulative effects? I imagine many people out there are probably just emotionally diminished from the violence and the death that we've been hearing about, and it seems to happen on a daily basis. So do you have any advice or thoughts, anything you're personally doing that might be helpful in this moment?
Well, we must talk with people. I have people that I can call and talk to and lean on, as well as people who call and talk to me and lean on me. But we have to revitalize ourselves because this is not over. We need to engage in this for the long haul. So for example, the police officer who used the chokehold on Eric Garner in New York, it took 5 years to get him off the force there. And so we see the amount of weeks that it's taken to have someone arrested, some of the officers arrested that engaged in killing some of the Black men that we've seen recently. And so I wrote a piece a couple of weeks back, right around the killing of George Floyd, where I said this looks like Groundhog Day because we've seen this before. And so it may happen again. We'll have a trial. They'll resurrect these people and probably kill them again in court. And then maybe get off. I don't know if they'll be convicted. And even if they lose the job, some organization or agency comes and pays them and they ride off into the sunset. Now, it's not that pretty. But for me, I get faith and energy out of the struggle of our people and understanding the plight of the slave, which I could never forget. But George Floyd's brother testified in Congress, and what he said really impacted me and gave me a lot of energy, because he said that even when George Floyd was being murdered, being killed with someone's knees in his neck, he was still saying, "Yes, sir." He was still genuflecting to the officer. Wow, in his dying moments. And if you think about that, and you can think about someone with their knee on your neck and it cutting off your windpipe, but we all can breathe, and I have a voice. And so I'll continue to use it until I tire myself out again, recuperate, and go at it again. Because this is a struggle for home, as I said. And so I have grandchildren, and I would not like them to experience some of the things that we've talked about today, or the things that I've seen in society. And so I'd like for them to have a home, a place where they can feel free to rest their head, not feel suspicious, drive down the street, walk on sidewalks, play, and engage in all the fruits of what it means to be an American without racism tampering that experience. And so for me, it's much work to be done in terms of that. And people give me strength.
I absolutely agree with that. Very powerfully said. I would actually say, I think this is correct for Dean Teasley and I. After George Floyd's death, I think we both found ourselves in a state of emotional despair. And so actually this discussion today is part of our way of coping about it. We wanted to have a conversation. We sought solace in each other. And we thought, well, we have the privilege, we have this immense privilege, given the roles that we both sit in. And so we can use this privilege to have the conversation more broadly. And so actually, for at least speaking for myself, today's session is one way in which I'm coping, is to talk about it and to learn about it and to have a better understanding. So like Dean Teasley, I find a lot of faith in my fellow humanity. We have over 500 people who were registered for today's webinar, which is amazing and gives me so much hope for our future. The fact that there are over 500 people out there who wanted to take time from their day to have this discussion with us is incredibly impactful. So I echo Dean Teasley's call and hope in humanity and people and engaging in these conversations. And so yes, even though some days I just get so tired. I had a video that was sent to me by a friend the other day of another Black man who apparently, just based on the video that was shared, I obviously don't know the context, was arrested for standing on the side of the street. Apparently didn't seem to be engaging in anything inappropriate. And I had to just turn off the video because I was just so tired of seeing these images, but also the privilege I possess as a phenotypically light-skinned woman who can just turn off the video because I'm emotionally tired is something that I have to recognize in myself. And I think we have to recognize in all of ourselves. So I absolutely encourage everyone to take time and to recharge where you have to, but also to acknowledge that we have tremendous privilege to be able to do that. There are some people in the United States who can never walk away from their reality and take time to recharge. And so that's what keeps bringing me back. And I think is really a powerful moment. So Dean Teasley, we got two other questions who came in while we were chatting. And I know we said ahead of time that we would be willing to go a little bit long. So if you want to stay with us for a little bit longer, we got two questions that came in. So for Dean Teasley, we got this question: what do we as social workers do when we meet resistance in our agency to address social justice issues for fear of lost funding?
And I'm not sure about the lost funding part. Is it that the person who would get a stipend or an agency may lose funding by engaging in some social justice activity? And that gets to a larger question, because the whole notion of tackling institutional racism means that people will have to give up some of their power and some of their resources so that others can share in them. I would say that when we have an agency that has a funding source that's based on something that we see as lacking in social justice in some form or another, one, we should probably go back and talk to our practicum supervisors about this, about ways of tackling this, and also know that you're not alone. And so there are a lot of resources here, not trying to take on things alone. These may be issues that are very relevant to the College of Social Work, and we have ethical stance on certain things. And so maybe the practicum supervisor may to the agency, so the student, him, her, or they, he, she, or they may not place themselves in harm's way. And the university in general has a no retaliation model, wouldn't tolerate anything like that. So without specifics, I'll just leave it at that.
Great. And I got one word or one question that came in for me that says, do you think racism works against American Indians in the same way as it does for African American? These themes seem to reflect how communities of color, Black, Indigenous people of color, are beginning to call for equal justice. So the answer is, does racism work against American Indians? Absolutely. Is it the same way that it works for African Americans? Yes and no. So I myself have struggled a little bit as a member of a marginalized and oppressed community, which is Indian country, and how to engage in this dialogue, which is focused very much and rightfully on the Black Lives Matter movement, because I think that there are a lot of issues that are special to the Black and African American and African communities within the United States, but also overlap heavily within the American Indian community. So how do I be an ally to the Black and African American and African community within the United States, while also acknowledging that some of these issues are impacting American Indians? And one of the biggest structural and systemic issues that we oftentimes face as American Indians is our invisibility. Because we tend to be a smaller population, and because many of us are isolated within reservations, so perhaps not engaging in a way that is obvious with the majority culture, oftentimes we are invisible to majority culture because of our small numbers. So for example, American Indian men are killed at an incredibly high rate by police officers and are also incarcerated at an incredibly high rate. And so, yes, the issues are the same, although the history of oppression is somewhat different. And I think that is very different, actually, the history of genocide and oppression between the two groups. There are some places historically where we came together in terms of our oppression, but we do have to acknowledge those historical differences between the two groups. But I think it's really important to be allies to each other rather than trying to engage in, sometimes I see people trying to engage in this rhetoric that our oppression was worse. And I've seen that happen in my own life instances. And I think that that's a really unhelpful conversation. I think it's enough to say that we were all oppressed. We were oppressed in different ways, but yet we have survived. We are all the dreams of our ancestors that our ancestors never thought could happen. And so we have some commonality. And I think it's really important for us to focus on those commonalities rather than necessarily our differences. But yes, there's some overlap there, but there's also some differences there. So with that, I believe we have reached the end of our time. I just want to thank again, Dean Teasley. Thanks for having this conversation. It was fantastic. And thank you, everyone. Again, the fact that so many of you were willing to take your time out of the day to have this conversation both personally heartens me and tells me that we should be having more of these conversations. So please stay tuned. We'll figure out a way to do that. Dean Teasley, any words of wisdom to conclude on?
I just want to thank Dean Kronk Warner for, she's actually the catalyst for this whole thing. I think she's a bit modest here. Thank you for inviting me. It was very engaging discussion. We'll have to do it again sometime. And I really want to thank all of you for taking time out of your day to come and impart some words of wisdom with us. Thank you so much, and be safe to all.
Okay, thank you.